Holy Week on the Island of the Dolls. La Isla de las Muñecas. The Island of Watching Dolls. The dolls were not moving when Thomas arrived on the island. But sometime after midnight, they were no longer facing the trees. They were all facing him. Years after the visit, Thomas wrote a short article about the island. But there was one detail he never explained. Something followed him home. There is a small island hidden in the canals south of Mexico City. An island where hundreds of dolls hang from the trees. Some are missing eyes. Some have no arms. Others are nothing more than cracked plastic faces staring through the branches. Locals say the dolls were placed there to calm a restless spirit. But visitors who stay too long sometimes say something else. They say the dolls are not meant to protect the island. They are there to watch. The origin of the island. The story of the island began decades ago with a man named Don Julian Santana Barrera. He lived alone on a small patch of land deep in the canals of Xochimilco, near Mexico City. One afternoon, according to local accounts, he discovered the body of a young girl floating near the edge of the island. Not long after, a doll appeared in the water nearby. Julian believed the doll belonged to the child, and he believed the girl's spirit had not left the island. To calm the spirit, he hung the doll from a tree. Then another, and another. Over the years, hundreds of dolls began to appear in the branches, tied to trunks, nailed to wooden beams, or half buried in the soil. Broken dolls, discarded dolls, dolls with empty eyes and cracked faces. The island slowly transformed into something else, a silent forest of watching faces. Thomas, the journalist. For years, the island remained mostly untouched. Tourists visited during the day, but very few were willing to stay after sunset. Thomas had heard the story before arriving in Mexico, a travel journalist from northern England. Thomas had spent years visiting places rumored to be haunted. He was known among colleagues for his skepticism. Tall, lean, athletic from years of hiking in remote locations, Thomas preferred facts to folklore. In his writing, he often said the same thing. Every haunted place eventually reveals an ordinary explanation. When he first heard about the Island of the Dolls, he assumed it was simply another tourist legend. But curiosity has a way of pulling people toward places they would normally avoid. His decision. In the spring of 2014, Thomas decided to visit the island himself. He wanted to see whether the story was simply an exaggeration, a tale told to visitors drifting slowly through the canals, or whether there was something stranger hiding among the trees. What happened during that visit would later appear in a short article Thomas published months afterward. The article was brief, but those who read it noticed something unusual. The man who had spent his career dismissing ghost stories ended his report with a warning. He wrote only one sentence about the island. "I do not believe in the supernatural, but I will never return there again." The journey into the shadow. The sun was a bruised purple over Xochimilco when Thomas stepped onto the trajinera. Usually, these wooden boats are symbols of riotous joy, painted in neon pinks and yellows, filled with the smell of grilled corn and the brassy shouts of mariachi bands celebrating the resurrection of Christ. But Thomas had paid his oarsman, a silent man named Alejandro, to steer away from the floating parties. As they drifted deeper into the labyrinth of the chinampas, the music faded. The bright artificial lights of the tourist docks were swallowed by the mist, rising from the dark, heavy water. Here, the canals narrowed. The lilies were no longer flowers. They were tangled, choking weeds that hissed against the hull of the boat. "It is the week of miracles," Alejandro said, his voice barely a rasp as he pushed the long wooden pole into the mud. "But some things do not want to be saved." Thomas checked his recorder. "It is just folklore, Alejandro. A man with a tragic past, and a lot of garbage, that is all." But as the boat rounded the final bend, the garbage began to take shape. The first sight. It started with a single foot, a small, pale plastic foot, dangling from a willow branch by a rusted wire. Then came the others. The island of the dolls did not emerge. It loomed, hundreds of them. They were not simply hanging. They were staged. Some were tied in clusters, a grotesque bouquet of severed limbs. Others were nailed through the chest, to the trunks of ancient trees, their stuffing weeping out like dry, yellowed guts. The heat of the Mexican afternoon had done terrible things to the plastic. The sun had blistered the skin of the dolls, turning pink cheeks into blackened, peeling sores. Dirt and mold had filled their eye sockets, giving them the appearance of weeping black bile. Thomas stepped onto the soft, spongy earth of the island. The ground felt wrong, too givey, like stepping on something that was still decomposing. "I will wait on the boat," Alejandro said. He did not drop the anchor. He kept his pole in the water, ready to move. The sound of the wind. Thomas pulled out his heavy DSLR camera. The silence on the island was absolute, save for the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the dolls hitting each other in the breeze. It sounded like teeth chattering. He walked toward the center of the island, toward the small wooden shack where Don Julian had lived. The further he went, the more he felt the sensation of 1,000 gazes. He told himself it was the gaze detection reflex, an evolutionary trait. When you see a face, even a plastic one, your brain tells you that you are being watched. But then, he saw the one. Pinned to a post near the door of the cabin was a doll that looked remarkably fresh. Its blue eyes were wide, and unlike the others, its eyelids still functioned. As the wind shifted, the doll's head tilted. Click. The eyelids snapped shut. Click. They snapped open again. Thomas froze. He looked at the doll's hands. They were not plastic. They were covered in real hair, matted, dark, and smelling of river silt. He reached out a trembling hand to touch it, to prove to himself it was synthetic. Just as his finger brushed the doll's cheek, the wind died completely. The clacking stopped, and from inside the darkened shack, he heard a sound that did not belong in a graveyard of toys. The wet, rhythmic sound of something heavy being dragged across floorboards. Schlop, schlop, schlop. The whispering thaw. "Is someone there?" Thomas called out. His voice sounded thin, brittle. No answer, only the smell, suddenly overpowering. Not just rotting vegetation, but the metallic copper scent of old blood and the cloying sweetness of incense used in funeral rites. He turned his flashlight toward the shack. The beam cut through the doorway, illuminating a shrine. Dozens of candles had been lit recently. The wax was still liquid, dripping like tears onto a photograph of a young girl. And then he heard it. A whisper. Not from the shack. From the trees behind him.
¿Me trajiste un regalo? Did you bring me a gift?
Thomas spun around. There was no one there, but the dolls. The dolls had changed. The wind had not returned, yet their heads were no longer facing the canal. They were all facing him. The altar of the damned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the festive spirit of Semana Santa felt like a cruel irony. In the distance, faint, distorted echoes of church bells from the mainland rang out for evening mass, a celebration of life and resurrection. But on the island, the air was thick with the stagnant scent of things that refused to stay buried. Thomas backed away from the shack, his boots sinking into the black, loamy soil. His flashlight beam danced across the trees. For a moment, it caught a flash of crimson. Propped against the base of a cypress tree was a doll dressed in tattered miniature lace, a mockery of an Easter Sunday dress. But where its face should have been, someone had stitched a dried pig's snout. Around its neck hung a rosary made of bird bones. The miracle of the season felt inverted here. If Easter was about the spirit leaving the tomb, the island was about the tomb reclaiming the spirit. Schlop, schlop. The dragging sound from inside the shack grew louder. Thomas did not wait to see what was pulling itself across those rot-weakened boards. He turned to run toward the canal, but the path had vanished. In the twilight, the willow branches had sagged lower, heavy with their plastic cargo, creating a curtain of artificial limbs. The procession of the silent. As he pushed through the hanging dolls, their cold, grimy surfaces brushed against his neck like the fingers of a drowned man. A jagged plastic thumb sliced his cheek. Suddenly, the distant church bells stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressurized. Then a new sound began, not a whisper, a collective creak. Thomas froze. He swung his light, slowly. Every doll on the island, the headless ones, the ones missing torsos, the scorched faces nailed to bark, they were vibrating. Their eyes were not simply reflecting the light, they were tracking it. He remembered a superstition Alejandro had mentioned. During Holy Week, the veil is thin. The spirits do not only watch, they participate. From the muddy canal bank, a rhythmic chanting began. Not human, like the rubbing of dry cicada wings. Pecado, pecado, pecado. Sin, sin, sin. Thomas reached the edge of the water, gasping for air, but the trajinera was gone. The canal was empty. Only hundreds of water lilies floated there. In the moonlight, they looked like the bald scalps of children. The water's gift. Alejandro! Thomas screamed. The mist swallowed the sound. A ripple broke the surface of the canal. Something was rising. At first, he thought it was a log. Then, he saw the hair, the girl, but not as a ghost in white. She was a nightmare, stitched together from the island itself. Her skin was a patchwork of sun-bleached doll plastic, held together with rusted wire. One eye was a cracked blue marble, the other a dark hole leaking river silt. She climbed onto the muddy bank with a jerking, mechanical motion. Snap, click, snap. Behind her, the dolls began to detach from the trees. One by one, they fell. Thud, thud, thud. They did not walk. They crawled, dragging broken bodies through the soil, a mockery of a religious procession. Thomas scrambled backward and fell. His hand plunged into the mud. His fingers closed around something cold, metal. He pulled it out, a heavy, rusted crucifix, likely dropped by Don Julian decades earlier. The patchwork girl stopped. She tilted her head. The wires in her neck shrieked.
Regalo, regalo.
The word did not come from her mouth. It came from every doll on the island at once.
Gift, gift.
The escape. In blind terror, Thomas did not pray. He did not raise the crucifix. He threw it, not at the girl, into the dark center of the canal. The splash echoed. For a moment, the girl turned toward the sound. The dolls turned with her, their obsession with gifts overriding their prey. Thomas ran, through reeds, through mud, through thorns, tearing his clothes. He ran until his lungs burned, until the chanting faded. Ahead of him, a dark shape, the trajinera. Alejandro stood frozen, pale as ash. Without a word, he grabbed Thomas and pulled him aboard. The boat drifted away. Thomas looked back. The island stood like jagged teeth against the moon. On the pier stood the patchwork girl. She held the crucifix he had thrown. She raised a plastic hand, not to wave, to point. Northern England. Months later, back in the gray quiet of his apartment in Northern England, Thomas sat at his desk. The article was finished. The warning was written. He reached for his coffee. His sleeve slid back. On his forearm, where the doll had scratched him, the skin had not healed. It had not scarred either. Instead, the flesh had hardened into a smooth, pale pink surface. He tapped it with his pen. Clink. Like plastic. Every night, since his return, he woke to a sound, a distant dragging across his floorboards. And every morning, a new gift waited on his nightstand. A button, a clump of river silt, single blue glass eye. The island never wanted his story. It wanted a replacement.